It had started in the farthest corner of my apartment. First as only the slightest hint of coppery red, before oozing from the ceiling and down the wall. I stumbled towards it, tripping over a laundry hamper and knocking it to the floor. It was funny looking, really. Against the yellowing wallpaper, it looked almost like a rookie's graffiti, still fresh and drying. I lifted a hand to touch it, but thought better. Up this close, the stench was overwhelming, like when the sink clogs and you pull out the stopper to find an enormous glob of hair. A smell mixed between bile and ammonia. A nauseous wave swept over me, attempting to pull up last week's dinner. In a panic, I ran to the window and was alarmed when it wouldn't open. Furiously, I scrambled to unlatch the lock and rattled it up for the first time in years. As I swallowed the tastiest hair I've ever had, I could only think, at least I know where the smell is coming from now. 1 month ago had been a party for me. I'd gotten home early from my job mopping floors at a hospital and had even had time to pick up a pizza on the way back. Now, I don't live in the best of areas, I'll admit, and whenever I pull into the unpainted parking space of my building, I always get that feeling that something bad might happen that day. The apartment's at least 200 years old and it shows. From the chipped red bricks to the way it tilts slightly towards the top, the Queen gives a sense of both unreliability and experience, and I'm sure it's experienced a lot. I push through the front glass door, complete with a head-sized hole, and begin the solemn march to the 8th floor and my room, number 48. I say solemn march because that's what it is. I don't want to see or talk to anyone here, and that's best done by staring at the floor as I walk, my face suitable blank. The first person I come across seems to have the same idea. He's wearing cheap plaid over a greasy t-shirt and doesn't even look my way as he slips into number 9, the Queen's Nightly Brothel. If I'm not mistaken. The Queen's a classy place. I cross up the stairs past a room that has smelled heavily of curry since I moved here, the same screaming rock music playing like a theme song. The door is open and I see a huddle of kids shooting up heroin or cocaine or maybe even bleach mixed with water. Who cares? I certainly don't. The walls up here are covered with what could either be mud or human excrement, and I try my best to guide the bulky pizza box up the stairs without touching anything. I see Old Man Taylor wobbling up the steps ahead of me. He's got his veteran's cap on again and he's humming some sort of oldie under his breath. I feel bad for him. I really do. It's hard to watch as his arms shake each time he releases the railing to climb up another step, his legs moving slowly with arthritis. Luckily, I'm on my floor now, so I won't have to wait 30 minutes before getting to my room. You having a party tonight, boy? His voice is raspy from smoking and muddled from time. I turn to have a look at him, hooking the box under my arm. Every night's a party, I remark, failing to come up with anything better. Why, what are you doing tonight? Nodding. I just want to say hello. No one says hello anymore. I smile to him and nod, thinking about how cold the pizza must be getting. He smiles back, a toothless thing, before returning to his journey upward as I jingle the keys into my door's lock. Inside, I smile when I see the pile of DVDs on the coffee table, the humming fridge with various appointments and magnets stuck to it, and the window overlooking the sleeping town. I'd survived another day. I throw the pizza down on the side of my mildew-streaked couch and turn on the TV. The television is older than Christ and doesn't have cable, but none of that matters. I put in my favorite television series, that 70s show, and begin the party with my best and only friends. My parents came for a visit 3 weeks later. The first thing they said when they walked in wasn't about how messy the room was. It wasn't about how I hadn't called them since last Christmas or how they thought I could do better than this dump. They complained about the smell. I blushed and pointed at the sink full to the brim with soap, water and old dishes, but they were sure that wasn't it. It smells like something died in here, they said. I fought back the urge to reply, yeah, my hopes and dreams. Honestly, I couldn't smell anything. Needless to say, they didn't stay long and I was alone again. That night, lying in bed, I began yearning for the past. I vividly lived through my childhood for what must have been the 8th time. I saw all the mistakes I had made and all the chances I never took. I saw her again, standing by the pool, waiting for me, but I'd never show up. I had told myself it was because I hadn't wanted to get my hair wet at the time. Now, it felt like self-sabotage, and I investigated every what-if scenario that could have happened if I'd gone. There was a sudden crash above my bed, as if a television or even a small bookcase had been kicked over. I was jolted out of my self-pity and back into reality. The crash was followed by a much smaller thump that was somehow more rattling than the first. That old man lived above me, of course. He might have fallen over for all I knew, and yet, I did nothing. It all went downhill from there. The next night I was haunted by what was the unmistakable sound of dripping. It was hard to hear, impossible during the day, but at night, when everything was quiet, that excruciating sound would begin. Like the ticking of a clock, getting louder and louder, never missing a beat. I envisioned a puddle of blackness being filled by an unnatural cloud. Within, my loved ones were drowning. I would turn to my static-strewn friends. But still the dripping continued, taking bits of sanity with every drop. And the smell, that horrible yellow smell, like a portal into hell had been opened. I was reminded of when I found my parakeet trapped behind the couch as a child, its rotting flesh and fecal fumes leaping off its carcass. I had cried for my parents then as I did now, but what could they do? I was enveloped in this travesty and I had shut them out of my life. Desperately, I searched my prison for the source of this evil. I pushed through all the toxins under the sink, scattered the mothballs under my bed, and checked the vents for dead creatures. That's when I found something odd. It seemed as if the source was coming through the vents themselves and not from my room at all. Immediately I bought a roll of duct tape and sealed off every vent I could find with 3 layers of tape. Gradually, the air began to clear and I could finally begin to think rationally again. To finish the job, I sprayed air freshener into every corner of every room, and that's when I noticed the spot. A single, crimson-red drip was gathering in the very corner by the window. Building in size like a blister, I watched as the bubble popped and streaked 5 inches down the wall. Several other red stalactites appeared and grew in size before following its comrade down towards the floor. It was bizarre. They began to take the shape of an upside-down tree, its branches a glaring sea of blood. I felt dinner begin to rise up my throat and I hurriedly shoved the window open, gasping for breath. I was even more shocked by what I saw below. There was a group of at least 10 men in bulky, yellow hazmat clothing exiting 2 white vans and running into the apartment. I couldn't believe what was happening. I pulled my head back inside to look at the growing red mark as it began to reach and soak into the carpet floor. I jumped back in surprise before the spot could reach my toes and headed for the door. Already I could hear the men as they charged up the stairs past my door, towards, my heart skipped a beat, Old Man Taylor's apartment. I slammed open the door and waved down an approaching hazmat man. I could tell he was out of breath without even seeing his face. "Please, exit the building, sir," he gasped. He didn't wait for me to reply, and so I did the only thing I could. I walked down the stairs with everyone else into the cold night air. On the eve of winter, Old Man Taylor had been found dead, I was told later. It turned out he'd hung himself over a month ago, and there he had stayed, like clothes in a closet or beef on a meat hook. No one had even noticed he was gone. His family never called him, nor he them. He didn't have any friends to speak of because he'd never speak a word to anyone. By all accounts of the few who knew him, he was a lonely man because he never took the time to be anything else. Either he felt he was too busy or he just didn't care, and he died that way. After a month of hanging there, his head had separated from his body. The crash was the body hitting the ground and the following thump. The rest of him, everything inside him had flooded out and dyed the white carpet around him red before soaking through the floor to repeat the pattern in my room. The only reason he was noticed missing was from the smell and a missing payment for his rent. I look back on this and realize with horror that we really weren't so different. I had shut myself off from the world into a cold loneliness I'm sure Taylor was very familiar with up until the bitter end. I've started going out more as a result. I've shut off the television and sold all my DVDs. I even called her again. I almost didn't, at first. But during the past month, I've learned that life is too short and sanity too fragile to lock myself in my room anymore. In the search for change, I've put away my news for good. Based on a true story. The girl who pushed open the shop door was too young for the cane she leaned on. I examined her from under the brim of my dark baker's boy cap. I sat in my tall swivel chair behind the counter, feet kicked up next to the register. 2 knitting needles clicked in my lap, the motion so mechanical I never looked down. They manipulated the strand of yarn into a nearly completed scarf. The little ball danced on the ground as I pulled from it. "Morning," I said. The girl flashed me a smile. "Good morning." She was polite, and didn't stare or even give a second glance to my eye patch, partially hidden under the brim of my cap. Since I had turned, I had never felt bad about taking what I needed, but this girl seemed oddly bright, naive even. What a waste. I couldn't wait any longer, though. My good eye never left her as she limped through the store. It wasn't hard, the shop was more of a nook than anything, and the bright and airy front windows did nothing to make the shelves seem less crowded. They were looming and solid, full of open front cubbies that displayed neatly stacked skeins of yarn. I had sorted them by weight and by color, careful to tuck all the loose ends away. I glanced down for a moment to finish off the scarf, looping it around my neck once it was free from the needles. When I surveyed my shop again, I saw that the girl had knocked a skein to the ground. She perused a nearby cubby, unaware. Spots danced in front of my eye. For a moment I expected to feel the accelerated pounding of my heart, as well. But then I remembered. "You dropped one," I said, my voice stiff. "What was that?" I gestured toward the rogue skein. "You dropped one." "Oh," the girl said, smiling, and replaced the yarn. She had to stoop down awkwardly, keeping her weight off her bad leg. Only once everything was back in order did I breathe deeply, feeling the passageways in my mind open back up like undammed rivers. I adjusted my baker's boy cap. "How long have you been knitting?" I asked, leaning my elbows on the counter. "Ever since I got hurt." She thumped her cane to emphasize her bad leg. "I couldn't walk at all for a while, and I needed to keep busy." "What happened?" "Car accident," she said simply. Her eyes met mine and I felt the emptiness under my eye patch. "We have a knitting group here sometimes," I offered, struggling to keep the pushiness out of my voice. It crept in anyway. "We could use some new members." "I'm all set, thanks though." "You don't even have to come," I said with a charming smile. "Just sign up and you get a free skein of yarn. All I need is your name and an email address." I could see her resolve breaking. "Preferably one you use, but hey, I'm not picky." "Fine, but only because I need this." She held up a skein of expensive alpaca yarn and smiled again. "Sign-up sheets in the back." I slid out of my tall chair before she could change her mind. I led her into the only other room in the shop, my windowless office that was no larger than a bread box. The fluorescent light flickered slightly. The desk was small and shoved into the corner, covered in neat stacks of paper. The faint smell of cleaning product hung in the air, and not a single mote of dust could be found. I produced the sign-up sheet from one of the perfect stacks of paper. "This is cozy," the girl said as she filled out her name and email. "It's really a supply closet." I closed the door and stood behind her. The cane leaned against my desk. I unwound the scarf from my neck and gripped an end in each hand. "Sorry about this," I said flatly, and looped the scarf around her neck, pulling it tight and cutting off her windpipe. She struggled, but her bad leg gave out and we both fell to the floor, crashing against the closed door on the way down. Her hands clawed at mine, but she grew weaker and was still after a few minutes. I loosened the scarf from her neck and wrapped it back around mine. That was easier than last time. The girl slumped forward, her hair spilled into her now puffy face. I pushed her onto her back and yanked my eye patch down around my neck, exposing my raw, empty eye socket. Mechanically, I pulled the girl's right eyelids wide open with one hand, and with the other I scooped my fingers under her eye, popping it out with a sickening squelch. I didn't flinch. Once upon a time I might have, but not now. Tendons popped as I freed it completely from the dead girl's distorted face. "Careful not to drop it," I pressed the organ into my own waiting eye socket, squeezing my lid shut over the foreign object. Warmth slowly radiated out from the new eye back into my face and head as my body adapted. I blinked rapidly, but my sight didn't return immediately, so I repositioned the eye patch once again. I walked out the front door of the shop, not bothering to lock up. I wouldn't be back here. Dismayed, I saw that the girl had left shallow scratch marks running up both of my forearms. Those would need to be replaced too, then. Just when I thought I was done for a while, I adjusted the baker's boy cap, pulling it lower over my eyes to block out the beams of sun that flickered between the low square buildings that populated the outskirts of the city. My legs were new enough that I walked normally, without the shuffling that usually plagued others like me. I was grateful to still look human. The warmth in my new eye grew more intense. I whistled as I walked down the sidewalk, eventually pulling off the eye patch and dropping it into the gutter, my eyesight restored. Back at the shop, I knew the girl would be stirring now. Act 1, Abby, suggested track, Coming Undone, by Korn. Abby didn't know what to do. Since her best friend was now an orphan, she convinced her parents to let Wendy stay with them until they graduated from high school. After that, she was going to move in with her aunt over the summer. Abby's main reasoning was that Wendy was going to need someone to lean on after such a horrible tragedy. Abby believed that she could be that person, but ever since Wendy moved in she had started becoming withdrawn from the world around her. Wendy hardly talked to anyone, she barely ate, and she often woke up screaming in the middle of the night. She always acted as if someone was following her, watching her. Yet she always wanted to be alone, not to mention her appearance had become startling from lack of sleep and care. When Abby tried talking to her, Wendy just shut her out. Abby didn't want Wendy to deal with her pain alone. But what could she do? It wasn't like before, when the worst thing that could happen to her was a petty argument with her parents. Her parents. If only they were here. But if they were here, then Abby wouldn't be having this problem. It was all his fault. Oh, how she hated him. From the moment she laid eyes on him, she knew he was trouble, but Wendy couldn't see it. All she could see was someone she could try to save. Now it was her who needed saving. And he was still out there. Somewhere. A month after the murders, on a rainy evening, Abby lay in her bed. Across the room from her, Wendy lay in her own bed scribbling furiously in a diary she had been keeping. When she finished, she placed it on her side of the bookshelf with her other belongings. Wendy then peeked out of her window and froze for a moment before closing the curtains. She looked over at Abby, who was starting to fall asleep. Abby? Remember when we first met, in middle school? Yeah, why? I was just thinking back on my life, and how far I've come. I've been trying to write them all down. All the good memories I have to leave behind, after I'm gone. Abby sleepily propped herself up on one elbow to look at her. Gone? Where are you going? Wendy didn't respond right away. Nowhere, it was just a figure of speech. Abby stared at her for a minute before collapsing back onto her pillow. Don't scare me like that. They were both silent for a minute. Abby started drifting off to sleep again. When we first met, I was the weird kid, Wendy said, waking Abby up again. I remember how nobody talked to me at first. I spent most of elementary school alone because I wasn't into the same things as every other kid my age. Then one day, you spoke to me. Yeah, Abby slurred, trying to remember. I told you I liked your dress, the one with the blue flowers on it. Yep, and we've been best friends ever since. And after that, more friends came. MMMHMM. I never thanked you for that, for being my friend. You didn't have to thank me. I liked you. I liked the fact that you were different. At least back then you were. High school normalized you. They both chuckled. Yeah, I became normal, whatever that means. But I was still drawn to weird people. Yeah. Abby yawned. Remember all those guys I dated? Wendy laughed. Stefan, Drew. Gary, the guy who was obsessed with chins? Jeff, the homicidal psychopath. Wendy was quiet for a moment. Abby sat up and looked at her. I'm sorry. But I can't help being a little mad at you for this. It's been a long enough time since the funerals for me to say that. I know you couldn't have known. But the worst part is that you've changed on me. This is the longest conversation we've had since. No, you're right, I haven't been a good friend, and I'm sorry. Abby, lay back down. No, don't be sorry. I forgot about that golden heart of yours. You could never think ill of anyone, not even him. He didn't seem dangerous at all while we were dating, Wendy said in a quiet voice. He was a bit distant and quiet, but I thought he genuinely loved. Wendy looked up to see that Abby had drifted off to sleep. She got up and walked over to her friend's bed. Crouching down in front of her, she tucked some stray hair behind her ear. Leaning down, she whispered in her ear, "Thanks for being my friend." Abby opened her heavy eyes long enough to see Wendy quietly walk out of the room. "Wendy, where are you going?" she moaned, but sleep overtook her as her vision got blurry, and then everything went black. The next morning, Abby woke up to find Wendy's bed empty. In fact, it didn't even look slept in. Abby sat up and tried to remember what happened the previous night. All that talk about looking back on her life and thanking her for being her friend, it almost seemed like she was saying goodbye. Abby searched the house calling her friend's name, but she was nowhere to be found. First she alerted her parents, then the police, and then the whole town. Some people claimed to have seen her on the night she went missing. But no matter how many search parties were sent out, no matter how much the reward was for any information on her whereabouts, no matter how much Abby wished, Wendy remained missing. 2 months after her disappearance, Abby noticed that the police were starting to give up. They had no leads, and no evidence of any kind. They began treating her as runaway because of her deep depression over the deaths of her parents, never mind the fact that none of her clothes or other belongings were missing. They didn't even bother to look through them. They assured Abby and her parents that Wendy would return when she was ready, or that she would eventually be found. Abby wasn't convinced, but she couldn't convince anyone else to listen to her. Her mother and father cared about Wendy very much, but they were tired and wanted to get on with their lives. So Abby had to find her friend on her own, or at the very least, find out what happened to her. Abby decided to start with Wendy's computer. Her boyfriend, Tucker, was an expert hacker. He could hack into just about anything. So when Abby asked if he could come over to try to break into her computer, he was almost insulted that she even asked if he could do it. After they successfully hacked into her computer, they did a wide search. Finding nothing suspicious, they decided to check her emails. But even after hacking into it, there were no emails or messages of any sort to give them a clue. Ugh. Abby sat back in her chair, exasperated. This is hopeless. Don't give up yet, babe, Tucker said, getting up and massaging her neck. I'm sure there's no need for any of this anyway. She'll come back. Yeah, and when she does I'm going to beat the living crap out of her. SHHH. He whispered. He massaged her neck a little bit harder, causing her to moan softly. Tucker smiled. Hey, I still have half an hour before I have to meet up with the guys. Your parents are out, wanna fool around a little? Abby leaned her head back to grin at him. I could use some comfort. After he left, Abby straightened herself up and then continued to explore Wendy's computer. Looking at her search history, Abby wondered just what was going through her friend's mind before she disappeared. There were searches about night terrors, sleep paralysis, and articles on other recent disappearances happening around town. Abby eventually found herself back in Wendy's email. She hadn't thought before to check the spam folder, so she clicked on it. Abby was shocked to find that there were hundreds of messages in the folder, all from an anonymous email address. Abby clicked on an email, which read, I'm coming for you. Abby was more than a little spooked. She clicked on another one, gonna get you, baby. Abby was frightened, but she clicked on another one, and another, and another. The more she read, the colder the chill creeping up her spine became. Don't try to run. No one can save you from me. There's no escape. There's nowhere to hide. You'll be mine again. You'd better not tell anyone, or they're next. The messages dated all the way back to the day after her parents' funeral. Abby shook her head as hot tears ran down her cheeks. So, she had been dealing with this all by herself, for so long. No wonder she had changed so much, and wouldn't let anyone in. Abby composed herself, and clicked on the very first message sent to Wendy. I want you, but we won't be separated for much longer. Jeff is coming. Abby's hand flew to her mouth. Jeff, of course. There was no denying it now, Jeff had something to do with it, but first she needed more proof. Abby quickly wiped away her tears and began to look through all of Wendy's things. She looked through her book bag, her side of the closest, under her bed, and her side of the bookshelf. She flipped through some of her notebooks. What she found were messages sloppily scrawled by her friend in the margins of almost every page. Jeff is coming for me. There's no escape for me, it's all over. I can't run, I can't hide. He won't stop. I have to protect them. No one else needs to die. Jeff. He's coming. She tossed it onto Wendy's bed to give to the police and looked through her other notebooks and textbooks. All the same, how could she have kept it inside all this time? Abby glanced at all the titles until her eyes rested on Wendy's journal partially hidden underneath a world history textbook. Cautiously, she picked it up and read the first entry. Dear Abby, if you are reading this, stop right now. By now I have probably disappeared, and I know you want answers, but it's too dangerous. Just forget about me, and move on with your life. You're strong, stronger than I am. But there's evil in this world that even you just can't fight. You'll definitely lose, so just put this down. In fact, bury it, or burn it. It doesn't matter now that I'm gone. I only kept it so that I could stay sane. I wanted to write down everything I could remember about my life, so that I wouldn't forget. I wanted to talk to you so badly, but that would have been sealing your doom. I won't make the same mistake twice. Goodbye Abby. You're my very best friend and I love you. Have a great life. Love, Wendy. After a few moments of uncontrollable sobbing, Abby wondered why she left the journal behind if it was so dangerous. Maybe she didn't get the opportunity to get rid of it. Abby stared at the journal, conflicted about whether or not to continue reading. She decided to take the chance. She flipped to the next page, but it was just an entry about her earliest memory. It went on like that for the first half of the journal, as if she were trying to write down every single memory of her life that she could remember. Even the memory of when they first met was there. Abby smiled as she tried to blink back tears. But then it took a dark turn. Wendy began to write about nightmares that she had been having. One about a pale-faced figure chasing her through the cornfields. Abby had heard about the night when Wendy was telling the police about her parents' murder. She remembered feeling infuriated about the fact that the police couldn't find the killer, even though he was just a teenage boy. The entries continued. Apparently Wendy sometimes couldn't sleep at night because she heard noises outside the window. Sometimes when she thought she was alone, she would feel like someone was watching her, but when she looked, no one was there. But there was someone there, as confirmed by the messages she was receiving. There was even a time when she actually saw him. It was a cold night. About a week before she disappeared, she had gotten up to close the window when she saw him. He was standing outside their window with his hood up, head held down. Since their bedroom was on the second floor, he couldn't reach her. Still, he slowly lifted his head and locked eyes with her. Wendy gasped at the sight of his face, but she didn't turn away. They stayed like that for what seemed like hours, but when Abby shifted in bed, blissfully unaware of any danger, Wendy turned to make sure she was still asleep. When she turned back to the window, he was gone. If she knew it was him, then why did she gasp when she saw his face? Abby wondered aloud. She sank down onto the bed. So he was here this whole time, yet no one even knew. No wonder Wendy felt so alone. Abby continued to flip through the journal, reading about many more mysterious things happening to her and about Wendy's depression and loneliness, but it wasn't until she got to the back of the book that Abby shrieked and let the book slip from her hands. Abby dropped to the floor and slowly opened the book again. On the back cover of the journal was a sketch of Jeff, dated a week before Wendy disappeared. But this was no ordinary portrait. He still wore the Joker makeup, but his face was now horribly mutilated. His eyelids, nose, and lips were all missing. The only color on the picture was the area around his mouth where Wendy had scribbled in red ink, and underneath his picture, also written in red, was one last message: "Jeff is here." Act 2, Tucker. Suggested track, Get Out Alive, by 3 Days Grace. Tucker was beginning to wonder if Abby wasn't into him anymore. Ever since he tried to help her find out what happened to Wendy, she had been acting strange. They barely hung out anymore, and she was returning his calls and messages less and less. At school, she was elusive, and it seemed like she wasn't concerned about her appearance anymore. She had always been a tomboy, preferring to wear jeans and t-shirts over skirts and high heels. But there was something different now. Now her outfits looked thrown together instead of having some sort of cohesion. And her hair, it was like she hadn't combed it in months. It wasn't like he really cared about how she looked, but he knew that something terrible must have happened. Did it have something to do with Wendy? But worse than all of that, she was always acting like someone was following her. Once, when he went over to her house to hang out, she insisted that they close all of the curtains and double-check the locks on every single window and door. He had suggested watching a movie, but when he put it on she was watching everything but. Abby kept glancing back and forth between the TV and the hallway, like someone would be walking through there at any moment. Not to mention that she jumped at every sound and her mind seemed elsewhere. When she would look at him, he felt like she was looking right through him. If she was in some kind of trouble, he needed to know. He hated feeling like he couldn't protect her, and after all, there was still a killer at large. Granted, Jeff might be long gone if he knew what was good for him. Still, Wendy was missing, and Jeff may have had something to do with it. Tucker decided to stop by her house after school to confront her about what was going on. It had been 3 weeks since he hacked into Wendy's computer for her, and since then he has heard no more talk about finding her from Abby. As Tucker was about to leave his house for Abby's, he heard the phone ring. He considered ignoring it, but then he remembered that his parents were out for a date night. He dashed into the kitchen and picked it up on the 4th ring. "Hello? Hello, Tucker? Abby, is that you? I was just about to come over." "No, don't come over." "Why not? You've been acting so weird lately. Are we even still together?" There was a pause and he heard her take a deep breath. "I'm really sorry, Tuck. I made a mistake." "What mistake?" Tucker asked, desperate. "It doesn't matter. I just wanted to let you know that I love you. And also, thank you for everything." "I love you too, but what's going on, Abby? Is this about Wendy? Have you found her? Is she coming back?" There was another pause, and then, "I don't think she's ever coming back, Tuck." "What? Why?" "No matter what happens, Tuck, no matter what, don't come looking for me. Don't ask questions. I want you to keep on living, and have a good life." "What are you talking about? Where are you going? Abby?" "Goodbye, Tucker, I love you." "Abby, wait." But she had already hung up. Tucker slowly put the phone back on the receiver and slumped against the wall. He couldn't be sure, maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. Right before Abby hung up the phone, he thought he heard an ominous male voice chuckling in the background. Tucker wasted no time jumping into his 1999 Chevy Silverado and speeding over to Abby's place. It only takes about 5 minutes to get to her house from his, so when he got there and banged on the door, he was surprised when no one answered. Tucker looked through the window next to the door, but the house was completely dark. He called out to her, but still, there was no answer. He ran around to the side of the house, and even to the back door, but he couldn't see or hear anything. She was gone. After waiting almost an hour on her doorstep, Tucker scribbled a note on some mail using a pen he happened to have in his truck. When he got home, he waited for hours. But she never called him. Finally, he decided to call her and really lay into her. "Hello? Hi, this is Tucker. May I speak to Abby? I'm sorry, Tuck, she isn't home. In fact, I thought she would be with you. No ma'am, I haven't seen her since we talked earlier. Well, that's strange. I wonder where she could be. Tucker paused for a moment. Then, I don't mean to alarm you, ma'am, but I think you should call the police. It was Wendy all over again. Abby had simply vanished, and no one knew why. Some people wondered if she had gone to find Wendy, others were convinced that her disappearance was linked to the other disappearances happening around town. But a smaller percentage, including Tucker, believed that a certain killer was the culprit. And Tucker was determined to find out if his suspicions were true. Tucker wasn't the only one who wanted answers. Abby's parents were sick with worry, and they exhausted every resource possible in order to find her. They called the police station daily demanding any news that they had. They even had the police go through Abby's things, unlike Wendy. What the police couldn't understand was why, just like with Wendy, none of her things were missing. It was as if she had just gotten up and walked out. There was no note, no clues, nothing. By the time a month had gone by, the police were ready to give up their search and label her as a runaway despite the evidence against that claim. Her parents were frantic. As time went on, they felt more and more alone in their search. Search parties and calls with information were occurring less, and the police began to brush them off. They were never the best police force anyway, because nothing really happened in that town. But there was one other person who was not ready to give up. Tucker began his own little investigation, beginning with asking after her around town. He picked a Saturday morning to begin, and by that Saturday afternoon he had gotten nowhere. No one had seen her the day she disappeared, no one had even seen her around the time because she barely went anywhere besides school in those last few weeks. Tucker was wondering what he should do next when he realized something. The day when everything changed was the same day that he had hacked into Wendy's computer. There must have been something important on there that she had found after he left. He realized that he would have to go back to her house and find out what it was. Instead of driving over to her house, he left his car at his house and jogged over to Abby's. He kept in constant contact with her parents, so he knew that Saturdays were when they both went out to do what they could to find their daughter, whether it's search for her, hand out flyers, or haunt the police station for any leads. Once he got there, he found the extra key hidden in a flower pot and headed up to her room. Glancing at the clock and noting the time, he quickly went to work. Instead of searching through Wendy's computer like he had originally planned, he instead logged on to Abby's. He never told her this, but he knew all of the login information because she wasn't as careful as she should have been while typing it in. There wasn't much on her computer, but there were tons of searches about the old house out in the cornfields. It looked like she was wondering if you could get internet connection from out there. Puzzled, Tucker checked through her files and there he found tons of pictures of the old house. Tucker began to wonder if that's where Wendy and Abby were hiding. But, why? He decided he would check it out later. But first, he would check her emails to see if she had been communicating with anyone besides him. Upon looking through her emails, he found nothing. Just the dozen or so emails he had sent to her that went unanswered and some other junk. But just as he was about to close out, he caught sight of her spam folder. After considering it, he decided that it wouldn't do any harm just to check. All of the messages were from an anonymous sender. Okay. That's weird, he muttered. Tucker decided to choose one at random. You were warned, but you just couldn't help yourself. And now you know too much. Tucker narrowed his eyes at the screen. Then he clicked on another, more recent one. Jeffrey's coming to get you, Abby dear. You'd better not tell. Tucker clenched his fists and turned away from the computer. Jeff, he said through his teeth, voice dripping with venom. Turning back to the computer, he clicked on a few more. Piecing together most of the emails, Tucker figured Abby had found out something about Jeff, and now Jeff was coming for her. He also knew in his gut that it had something to do with Wendy. She better not be dead, you fucker, Tucker muttered as he held his head in his hands. Fresh tears rolled down his cheeks. He didn't want to admit what he already knew was true. "I'll find you, Jeff, I swear I'll." Then, it hit him. A simple connection, the common denominator. Of course Jeff had never left, he had been living right under everyone's noses this whole time. Tucker clicked out of her email and brought up the window that he had used to search Abby's most recent history. He brought up the most recent search, and there it was. The place where Wendy was found shivering in the darkness, the place that Abby had become obsessed with, the place where no one would think to look. The old abandoned house in the cornfields, that's where Jeff was. Tucker didn't stop to think. Instead, almost in a trance-like state, he put everything back in order, and left the room. When he got home, he wrote a goodbye letter to his parents, telling them that he loved them, and that he was leaving to be with Abby. He wrote it, knowing that he may never return. Some don't come back when they set off to confront evil. Tucker pushed his way through the cornfields. He knew the way to the house like the back of his hand. He shook away the thoughts that tried to force their way into his head of him, Abby, and other neighborhood kids playing out here when they were younger. No distractions. They could still be alive, though the chance was slim. Either way, he needed to know everything, or else he would never find peace. It wasn't long before he could see the dark house looming before him. Once he had stepped onto the porch, he took a deep breath, and reached for the doorknob. "Run." Tucker whirled around, but there was nothing there but the cornfields from whence he came. "Abby?" he whispered. He could have sworn he had heard her just now. But that was impossible. It must have been his imagination, or the wind whispering through the fields. Or maybe it was his subconscious crying out for him to get as far away from this place as he could, and it took on the voice of the person who was always on his mind. But it was too late, he was here now. And the fear that gripped him and shook him to the bone was not enough to stop him. Once again he closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and opened the door. The smell of death and rot immediately slapped him in the face and forced him to take a step back. It was so strong that he actually gagged and had to force himself not to throw up. Despite the overwhelming smell, he stumbled into the dark house and tried to find his way around. The house had 2 stories, including a basement and an attic. He knew that Jeff was most likely on the 2nd floor, that's where all of the bedrooms were. Tucker closed his eyes as he tried not to think about all of the times that he and Abby had snuck out here to make out in the master bedroom. Strangely enough, the house was fully furnished with ancient furniture and old photographs. It was the perfect place for a killer to hang around. But there was no electricity, so how in the world could he survive here? Darkness. He was a creature of the darkness, that's why. After finding the stairway, he started to climb it only to slip on some sort of dark liquid. Luckily he caught himself on the railing, but that also was covered in warm liquid. Tucker quickly pulled his hand away, knowing what it very well could be. He tiptoed up the stairs but stopped at the top. He cocked his head to the side and listened. There was a sound coming from his right. A very distinct sound, like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. Tucker gulped and headed towards the sound. Eventually, he could see a flickering light coming from the room at the end of the hallway. There was also what Tucker assumed to be a blood trail and bloody footprints leading into that room. The dragging sound got louder as he reached the door. Tucker leaned against the wall next to the doorway and composed himself. He wanted so badly to bide his time and wait for the police, whom he had called right before heading out. They had sounded skeptical, and he knew that they would probably take their time in getting there. A killer right under their noses, and in the most obvious place this whole time? Yeah, right. Still, he was sure they would come. But he couldn't wait for whenever that may be at the risk of Jeff escaping. So with a trembling heart, he turned and stepped into the room. The room looked like any other bedroom, except for a few things. For one, there was nothing in it but a large bed, a desk with a computer and one candle on it, and another, smaller, doorway. From what Tucker could make out in the dim light, the walls and floor were covered in splotches of blood, some of them spelling out actual words. Tucker couldn't read what the words said, but it wasn't important to him at the moment. What was important were the two figures in the room that had stopped moving as soon as he stepped in. The first figure he saw was a young woman lying on the floor. She was dead, her body nearly cut in two and its contents spilling out around her. He could see her empty eyes in the candlelight, wide and staring. She looked to be very beautiful, with long blood-stained blonde hair and gray eyes. Her hand was being held in another hand, belonging to the one who had dragged her broken body all the way up the stairs to this very room. It seemed to be in the middle of dragging her to the second door, because its hand had frozen in the middle of reaching for the doorknob. This figure was standing just out of the candle's range, so it was consumed by shadows. But Tucker knew exactly who it was. Jeff. The figure dropped the girl's hand and let the other hand fall to its side. It just stood there for a moment, and then it began to chuckle quietly. "So I see you didn't take her warning to heart," came a voice that sounded like it would better suit a serpent than a human being. Tucker flinched at the sound of that voice. It sounded much more malicious than what he remembered, but he could still tell who it belonged to. "What have you done with her?" he demanded, sounding much more confident than he actually was. "You should have stayed away. Hey, I might have left you alone. But now. Stop fucking around and answer my goddamn question." The figure was silent for a moment. Then he stepped over the corpse and into the light. Tucker sucked in a breath as he saw Jeff for the first time in months. The boy he had known in school was normal compared to the creature that stood before him now. The long unkempt black hair and bone-white skin were still the same, but now his face was horribly disfigured. His eyelids were gone, leaving behind emotionless eyes with black rings around them that seemed to stare right into Tucker's soul. His nose was gone too, but for some reason there was no hole where it used to be, just a small white hump. His lips were also gone, so now he no longer needed Joker makeup to give himself a permanent smile. His clothes were the same though, a white hoodie with fresh blood on it, and black pants. "Jesus Christ. What happened to you?" Tucker asked, more than a little shaken. "What happened?" Jeff cocked his head back and let out a throaty laugh that sent chills down Tucker's spine. "She happened," he said at last. "Wendy?" Jeff said nothing. "Why did you take her? Why did you kill her parents? Why did you? What did you do to Abby?" Jeff cocked his head to the side and his evil grin seemed to grow wider. "You want answers? Well, I guess I can confide in you. Since you won't be around for much longer." Tucker wondered if he should just run. If he left now he might be able to make it out of there alive. But he couldn't, he needed to know. Besides, the police should be on their way by now, right? Instead of immediately talking, Jeff casually turned and picked up the girl from the floor and placed her on the bed, careful not to spill anything. He then sat down at his desk and faced Tucker, who still remained in the doorway. "I'll have some fun with her later. Hey. Now where should I begin? Oh yes, ever since I was 12, I've had these urges. The urge to kill, specifically. I loved it, and ever since my first kill I've been dying to do it more and more and more. It gave me joy like no other to take someone's life, that is, until I came here." Tucker was only mildly interested in what he had to say. He wasn't at all surprised that Jeff was psychotic. He only wanted to stall, and find out if his Abby was still alive. But then he thought maybe there was a way he could take down Jeff himself, so he decided to listen more carefully. "As you could imagine, for 6 years I've been on the run from my past. I'd travel from city to city, have my fill of fun, then move on. When I got here, it was easy to make up some bullshit story about living with my great-aunt. In reality I just hid out at some rich old bitch's house who I had kept hostage. For a while." Tucker stopped himself from rolling his eyes. He absolutely hated Jeff, a person who would kill without remorse or regard for someone's life. But in order to find out what happened, he had to keep listening. "I enrolled myself in school to scout some potential victims," Jeff went on. "I usually try to pick people who I can gain something from. But then I met Wendy. She came frolicking into my life without warning, and suddenly everything changed. She was changing me. At first I fancied her as my first victim here, but I actually began to fall for her. Several times I tried to kill her, the first time being after we had sex for the first time. She lay there, fast asleep, and I straddled her and pulled the knife out from underneath the pillow. But as I raised the knife to stab her in the heart, I hesitated. I saw how beautiful she looked sleeping so peacefully, and I hesitated. Tucker noted how Jeff's voice had changed over the course of him telling this story. He almost sounded normal. Like a normal person struggling with their feelings. Too bad he wasn't a normal person, and this wasn't a normal love story. I hated myself for it. I was starting to slip. I went out on killing sprees less and less, and began to spend more time with her. The second time I was planning to kill her, she told me she loved me, and I couldn't bring myself to use the axe I had hidden underneath the table to hack her to pieces. And the third time, I was really going to do it. Tucker perked up again at the change of tone in Jeff's voice. He figured he knew what story Jeff was about to tell now. I had to get rid of her, so that I would be able to freely do what I wanted. I couldn't allow myself to have feelings for her. It was changing me and I didn't like it. So I planned everything out so nothing would go wrong this time. While she was out partying, I killed her parents, then waited for her to come home. When she got there, oh, her face was priceless. It filled my heart with such glee to see her in so much pain. Yes, the feeling was back again. I knew I could do it this time. I followed her all the way here, wounding her in the process. I didn't want any chances for her to escape, so I made sure she wouldn't be able to run far. Tucker nodded solemnly, remembering the wound on the back of Wendy's knee that never quite healed, just like her broken heart. I was so ready to end her, but then Jeff scratched his arm and twitched nervously. Then she kissed me, and the urge was completely gone. It was such a shock that I couldn't do anything. I just had to get away from her. Tucker shook his head. If only you had just let it change you. You could have been happy with her. But instead, I went back to the old lady's house. I couldn't stay there long because the smell coming from her basement was starting to bug the neighbors. I looked at myself in the mirror and cursed myself for being so weak. I knew I had to do something drastic. Think. And then I knew, it was my lips that had betrayed me. I had to get rid of them, so I did. And while I was at it, why not punish myself further? I burned off my eyelids. I had no real use for them, and now I would never lose sight of my desires. Jeff's serpent-like voice had returned by now. And your nose? Tucker asked, grimly. Just an added bonus, to seal the deal. Jeff then stood up, and looked Tucker square in the face. There was nothing stopping me anymore. I was transformed. I just needed to do one more thing to make sure I never went back. This time I kept a safe distance from her. Instead I sent her threatening emails, and stalked her at night. I wanted to weaken her resolve by slowly driving her insane. And it worked. By the time I was through with her, she had no will to live and accepted her fate without a struggle. I had won. Tucker glared at him. What did you do to her? What do you think? Jeff said, teasingly. I took her. Tucker took an angry step forward, but immediately regretted it. And Abby? Why did you go after her? She went investigating, just like I knew she would, and found out too much. I did the same to her, only she was much stronger than Wendy. Still, she eventually realized she couldn't escape from me. Should have heeded Wendy's warning. Tucker felt sick. His head began to swim, and he swayed back and forth on his feet. How could something so evil exist in this world? By this time, he knew they were dead, but still he had to ask once more. Where are they? Where are Abby and Wendy now? Jeff's unholy grin grew so wide that it nearly split his face in half, and he gestured around the room. Why? They're here. Jeff produced a large knife from the pocket of his hoodie and advanced toward him. Tucker knew what that meant. It meant that the police weren't going to make it in time after all. Instead of running, like his subconscious was currently screaming for him to do, he simply closed his eyes and thought of Abby. They're right here with us. Jeff went on, is a harsh whisper. You can see them if you want. All you have to do is go to sleep. Credit to Angel Rocket Sleep. Credit to Angel Rocket Sleep. Credit to Angel Rocket Sleep. Act 3, Officer Jane, Suggested Track, Teenagers, by My Chemical Romance. Officer Thomas Jane and his rookie partner, Jade Mason, walked lazily through the cornfields, occasionally flashing their flashlight at every sound they heard. Officer Jane hated nights like this, when teens prank called the station, yet he was still obligated to check it out. He knew he wouldn't find anything, so he didn't object when Officer Mason suggested they stop for coffee. Even so, according to the operator, the kid who called sounded really calm, an unnatural sort of calm, like the kind that comes before a storm. He knew the kid too, the one whose girlfriend went missing after her best friend disappeared not long after her parents were murdered. It seemed like ever since that boy came to town, there was just one bad thing after another. But why would the killer stay here? It didn't make any sense. The kid had to be mistaken. As soon as they reached the house, Officer Jane felt like there was something wrong. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something didn't feel right. He turned to his partner. "Get your gun ready, Mason, I have a bad feeling about this." Officer Mason nodded solemnly and did as she was told. As soon as they opened the door, a powerful odor hit them. Officer Mason wouldn't know, but Officer Jane recognized that smell. It was the smell of death. Once again he turned to his fellow officer. "I think we're going to need backup." After calling for backup, the two officers cautiously entered the house. Not knowing whether or not the killer was still there, they decided to stick together at first. They searched all of the rooms on the first floor, eventually making their way to the living room. Officer Mason let out a shriek as she shined her flashlight over the couches. When Officer Jane shone his flashlight as well, all he could utter was "Mother of God." There were corpses everywhere, of men, women and children of all ages, and in various stages of decay. There must have been over a dozen of them. They were all posed in different positions, as if they were friends and families gathering together for afternoon tea. There were people slumped on the couch reading a book, or sitting in a chair with a newspaper. Some were even sitting on the floor, posed as if playing a board game. Their mouths were agape, and their eyes were rolled to the back of their heads. As the officers began to examine them, they recognized a few from the missing posters that had skyrocketed in recent months. Officer Mason had to leave the house to throw up outside. Officer Jane remained inside, wondering why there weren't any flies surrounding the bodies. As the officers made their way to the stairwell, they noticed the dried blood on the floor and the rail. They gave each other a wary look, and then continued on, guns at the ready. Once they reached the top floor, they split up and checked each room. They were all the same as the living room, more corpses, all posed in various positions, their mouths and eyes agape. They were all in different stages of decay, some fresher than Officer Jane would have liked. "Just what kind of sick fuck are we dealing with?" he murmured, to no one in particular. "Jane." Officer Mason called from another room. "I've got something over here." Officer Jane followed her voice to a middle closet. Officer Mason wore a grave expression on her face, but she nodded towards the open door. Officer Jane took a deep breath and aimed his flashlight into the closet. Inside were the bodies of two teenage girls. One was a lot more decayed than the other, but there was something strange about the way they were positioned. They were leaning against each other, the eyes and mouths closed in what could have been a peaceful slumber. They were holding each other's hand, and wrapped around the two bodies was red string, tying them together. A tap on his shoulder startled Officer Jane, but before he could say anything, Officer Mason pointed above the heads of the bodies. Following her finger, Officer Jane saw that written in blood were the words "loved and lost." Officer Jane wondered what that meant, but he couldn't dwell on it right now. There was still one more room that they needed to check, and hopefully the killer was still hiding there. As they made their way to the end of the hall, they could hear sirens approaching. They're back up, finally. It would take them a while to make it through the cornfields. Officer Jane didn't have time to go down and give them a briefing. He had to see what was in that last room. He looked at his partner, who looked back at him with a determined expression on her face. He knew she was afraid, but he also knew that she wanted to take this person down as much as he did. She would never forget this experience for the rest of her career. She could no longer be considered a rookie cop. Today, she had seen more than half the cops on the force. Things like this just didn't happen in their peaceful town. When they entered the last room, Officer Mason once again had to stop herself from throwing up. Lying on the bed was a young woman, her abdomen sliced open and her entrails falling out. She was a fresh corpse, Officer Jane realized as he examined her. She was pretty too, such a shame. They looked around for the killer, but they quickly realized he was long gone. There was a desk with a computer monitor on it, but the computer itself was gone. He must have found out we were coming. Officer Mason sniffed. Yeah, while we were out there taking our time, he was escaping. I wonder how he was able to use this computer. What? Officer Jane said, turning to her. Officer Mason looked stunned. The computer, how could he have used the internet when there's no signal or any electricity out here? How do we even know he used it? Well, why would he take it if he hadn't been using it? A monitor with no computer? That doesn't make sense. Yeah. Officer Jane didn't have much time to think about it, as he could hear the other officers coming through the door and calling out to them. I guess I'll go down and tell them the situation, seeing as how he's not here anymore. Alright, I'll stay up here and look around some more. As Officer Jane headed to the stairway, he tried to collect his thoughts. He was ready for this nightmare to be over, but he knew it wouldn't be for a long time. And what's worse, the killer had escaped because they hadn't taken the call seriously. Just as he reached the top of the stairs, he heard a shout coming from the room at the end of the hall. Officer Jane, followed by the other officers that had come as backup, ran to the room with their guns ready. But when they reached the room, it was empty save for the young girl who was already dead. In here, came a muffled voice from a small doorway. Officer Jane and the other officers slowly entered the room. A fresh metallic smell filled their noses upon entering. They all flashed their lights around the room. Lying on a bloody metal operating table was a teenage boy. His hands and feet were tied down, and his throat was slit. Officer Mason was leaning over him. He still wore him, she said, her voice quivering as she tried not to cry. This must be the boy who called 911. We came too late. And that's not all, said an officer named Joe Rake, as Officer Jane comforted his partner. It looks like we've got a confession. All of the officers simultaneously aimed their lights where Officer Rake was pointing his. On the wall above the boy's body, written in fresh blood, was a message: Jeff was here. Prologue, Wendy, Suggested Tracks, Monsters, by Matchbook Romance or Cat and Mouse, by TRJA. Wendy ran as fast as she could. She had no time to stop at any of the houses that flew by as she ran, because she knew the darkness was closing in on her. Besides, this was all her fault, her grave mistake. She had allowed darkness into her life, and she wasn't about to lead it into others. Her parents had already paid the price for it. She blinked back tears as she remembered, just moments before, how she had walked in to find the disemboweled bodies of her parents lying in a heap on the floor, and how a dark figure had stepped from the shadows into the moonlight, holding a bloody knife, and revealing himself to be. Wendy shook her head as she continued to run. Now was not the time. He was coming for her, and she had to lead him as far away from her little hometown as possible. All of her friends and neighbors were there, she could at least save them. Wendy had resigned herself to her fate, it was what she deserved after all. But how could she have known that the one she loved the most would turn out to be something wicked? Wendy paused to catch her breath. She was standing in front of the cornfield that separated her town from the next one. Wendy thought back again to when she had first met him. She was always drawn to strange people, and the new boy in town definitely fit the bill. Everyone stayed away from him at school, so she was the only one brave enough to talk to him. It wasn't long before she had fallen hard, and despite everyone, including her best friend Abby, warning her that he was dangerous, they began dating. Looking back on it now, it seemed like she had cared about him more than he cared about her. It was like he was void of any emotions. But Wendy didn't have long to reminisce. A whizzing sound interrupted her thoughts, and before she could turn around she felt a sharp pain in her leg. "Ah," she moaned, as she fell to the ground. Upon examining her leg, she discovered a small pocket knife protruding from it. Looking up, she could just make out his silhouette in the distance. He always did have impeccable aim. She gritted her teeth, pulled out the knife, tried to stand. Because the knife hit her in the back of her knee, she knew that running would now be difficult. She also knew that he knew that as well. The silhouette was getting closer. Wendy forced herself to stand, ignoring the pain, and limped into the cornfields. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw that she was leaving a trail of blood behind. It would most assuredly lead him straight to her. He must have predicted that as well. Oh well, it didn't matter now. He was away from the town, and her best friend, that's all that mattered. Finally, up ahead she could make out what she was looking for. There was an old abandoned house in the middle of those cornfields. No one knows why it was there. Rumor has it that it had been there ever since the town was first established. It certainly looked hundreds of years old. It also looked similar to a plantation house, only not as big. Still, it was pretty big, and spooky. No one, as far as Wendy knew, had ever lived there or even had any interest in buying it. She and her friends used to dare each other to spend the night there when they were kids. Who could have known that this would be her final resting place? Since no one bothered to lock the doors, Wendy staggered inside, slamming the door behind her. The pain in her leg was becoming unbearable, and the loss of blood was starting to make her head spin. Wendy collapsed against a wall in the living room and glanced around the empty house. As she waited for him to come, she wondered what she should do. She had come here without a plan, only wanting to lead him away. But what happens after? How could she be sure that he wouldn't simply go back? No, she wouldn't let that happen. She had let the wrong one in, so he was her responsibility. It would all end here. Her head snapped up as the front door slowly opened. She was out of time. Using the windowsill next to her, she managed to stand. The silhouette entered and, after locating her, calmly walked in. Wendy pressed her back against the wall and held her breath as he inched closer and closer. The closer he got, the more clearly she could see him, thanks to the light provided by the window. When he was just an arm's length away, she could examine him in his entirety: the bloody white hoodie, the knife that used on her parents, the long black hair covering most of his face. Wendy wanted to look into his cold black eyes, but he held his head slightly down, making it difficult. Instead, Wendy glanced again at the knife that he gripped in his hand as if his life depended on it. "Jeff," Wendy murmured. Jeff slowly lifted his head. She could only see one eye, but its stare burned into hers. Carefully, she lifted her hand and pushed his hair aside. His face was made up like it always was, like the Joker. She had found his strangeness interesting, but it scared everyone else to look at him. A demented clown is what their schoolmates had called him behind his back. "Jeff," she said again. "Why are you doing this?" Tears rolled down her cheeks as memories of their short time together flashed through her mind. "I don't understand. What did I do wrong?" She went on. I loved you, Jeff. I thought you felt the same way." Jeff said nothing. He simply took a step back and raised his knife, preparing to strike. Wendy nodded, realizing that she might never know. "All right, Jeff, if this is what you want. Just one more kiss before I go?" Before Jeff could respond, she wrapped her arms around his neck and leaned him down for a kiss. His lips were soft, like they had always been, but this kiss was different. He didn't return it, he merely stood there as she embraced him. Wendy dropped one of her arms to discreetly dig into her pocket. She gripped the pocket knife that he had thrown at her earlier, but did not pull it out. Up until a few moments ago, she wasn't sure if she could even use it on him. Now, she was definitely sure that she couldn't. No matter what he had done, Wendy let go of him, and leaned back against the wall. Wendy studied his face, which was now dumbfounded, and his breathing quickened. She couldn't understand why, but it didn't matter. "Goodbye, Jeff." Wendy closed her eyes and waited. And waited. And waited. After what seemed like forever, She slowly opened her eyes. He was gone. Without a word, without a sound. The front door was opened wider than it had been before, so she was truly alone. Instead of leaving right away, she sank to the floor and wept. Credit to Angel Rocket. I hadn't done anything different that day. It started off very normal. In fact, I awoke to the blaring alarm clock. I brushed my teeth. I fixed a breakfast, and ate it. I kissed my mum goodbye and I dashed out the front door, swinging my backpack with me. I sat on the bench at the bus stop, waiting for the bus to arrive. I get there early every day, just to be sure. The only thing different that I recall would be the grass. It looked a little greener. I entered the bus and found a seat. At my seat near the back of the bus, I rested my headphones on my head and listened to some music. I listened to the mellower songs in the morning. As time passed, the bus quickly filled up with people. It was a school bus. The children were chattering and teasing and twisting and shouting. They were normal kids. With the headphones, however, all I could hear was the music, the soft piano layered on melodic, spacey harps and horns. I don't listen to normal music. We reached the school. With the headphones still on, I get up with the rest of the kids and become a drop in a rushing ocean of children, not eager for class, but eager to arrive. School was loud and busy. The classrooms, filled with students and teachers, went on teaching all manner of subjects, while the students remained restless and less enthusiastic of the knowledge. I met up with all my friends at recess. I played basketball with Tommy and Michael. They were my closest friends on the playground. After we tired of basketball, we went and dug around the rocks and wood chips that edged the enclosure, looking for bugs and worms. I distinctly remember the moment just before the blackout. We were taking long wood chips and poking at the dirt with them. I joked with Michael about what we would do if we found a little bug friend. Tommy said he'd squish it, but we laughed, knowing he wouldn't ever do such a thing. The giggles resided and I shifted my gaze to the dirt on the ground, smiling and stabbing away. For 3 years, I'd been having these episodes, my mother calls them. They occur every few months or so, just when we think they're gone for good. To my mom, I just go limp and blackout, waking up 45 minutes later in a hospital bed with doctors around me. My mother knew nothing of my experiences during the 45 minutes of being out. Imagine a night of sleep where you don't remember your dreams, where it's a brief blackness that is ended by your eyes waking up to the morning light or your ears sucking you into reality from an alarm. That's what I saw, except in that darkness, there is a figure. The face is shrouded and the details are indistinguishable. It didn't feel like a dream either, rather, this figure has been watching me all my life and I just now peer through another world and meet his dark gaze. He just waits and watches. Nothing had been said, and nothing moved. But I knew he was there. I got that recognizable feeling of another presence with me. As I stabbed at the dirt, the episode began. I recognized that it was beginning as soon as I felt my eyes were about to pop out of my face. But by then, my breathing had already stopped and I couldn't speak. My fingertips began to tingle, my face and feet began to burn, hot, as blood pooled to them. A horrible sensation deep inside my stomach wrenched and tore me. At this point, I lost my vision and consciousness. I don't remember ever hitting the dirt. I was in my blackness again. This had happened so many times before, that I thought I had become familiar with the figure, as well as the blackness. I was ready to meet him, and to stare into his strange gaze. However, for the first time, I was struck with fear. The figure was there, in the blackness, but I feared it. I hadn't before. It was strange, but I just wanted it to end. Yes. The figure spoke. I heard his voice with chilling clarity. It was deep and old. You are. He took a deep inhale, as if he'd just completed a long, daunting task. Done. Done. That's it. I woke up on the playground. The sun had moved to the other side of the sky, so time had passed. It was dead silent. Looking around, the lot was completely empty. I get up, confused. Usually I wake in a hospital or on the floor of the office with the teachers gathered around. I approached the glass doors to enter the school. Peering through the glass, I saw nobody. I walked inside. In the office, I sat in the chairs by the door to regain my thoughts. I hear the rustling of papers and look up. I see a folder floating through the air, from the main desk and down a corridor. Bite the bullet. Sponsored links you may like. Top 10 Most Dangerous Countries to Visit. WomenArticle.com. I quickly got up and followed the folder. Down the corridor, a door opened and the folder drifted in. I follow, and watch as the folder approached the desk. The swivel chair turns and the folder flopped down on the table. I bolted out of the office, feeling alone and confused. I ran to a classroom and saw a piece of chalk writing A on the chalkboard. I panicked and left the school. I saw cars driving in the streets without passengers, doors opening for no people, gardens being gardened by floating tools. I couldn't see people. After a very long while, maybe weeks or months, I noticed a few things. I couldn't see my reflection. I could have guessed that. What's interesting, however, is that I don't seem to get hungry or need to eat. I just sort of wandered around, looking at things. The boredom drove me crazy. The only thing worse than the boredom was the loneliness. I kept myself company by talking to myself while I aimlessly wandered city streets, houses, stores, parks, and anywhere my feet could take me. I'd watch as people I couldn't see went about their daily lives. The wandering eventually became an interesting task for me. I would go for very long walks during the day, counting the numbers on people's home addresses. I'd see floating hoses watering lawns and drifting helmets riding bicycles. At night I would sprint through the streets, dashing under street lights. I came up upon a library. That kept me busy for a long while. I scanned the bookshelves and read almost half the books in the entire place. I just sat alongside other floating books, knowing somebody invisible is getting a good read. I'm able to retain information very well. I came across a cemetery. I spent a long while scanning the tombstones, reciting the names to see if any rang a bell. I recognized a few last names of my old friends. I would look at the dates and count how many years they lived to be. Sometimes I'd see incomplete dates, tombstones of those yet to die. This humbles me as I ponder those planning for death. I felt sorry for them. Sometimes I'd come back and find the incomplete dates completed, the dirt freshly turned. I'd go along, row by row. At night I couldn't read them, so I'd sprint through the streets, dodging cars that couldn't see me. Today, I was finishing up my cemetery walk. I came across a tombstone with my name on it. The realization hit me hard, but it makes more sense now. The birth year and the death year were both engraved. I stared at it for a long while. You wouldn't believe how upset I was. I thought one day I'd wake up and see my mom again. I thought maybe I was in the hospital, and I'd wake up, get better and go back to school to play with Tommy and Michael. I think I cried, but I understand that I probably don't have any real tears. After sitting for a while, an idea occurred to me that hadn't before. And that's how I got here. I know I can interact with the objects in this afterlife, but I also know that the living live among me as well. I went into my old house, it's more familiar. I get on my computer and type what I know. I submit it onto this website where hopefully it won't gain too much attention, Creepypasta, where stories like this are abundant, but fiction mostly. I guess I'm mostly just writing this to organize my thoughts about what had happened, especially with today's realization. I doubt I'd be able to actually send any sort of message to the living world. I had tried before, to no avail. Oh well, it's not like I don't have time to waste. Credit to Nick Fairley to waste.